Good day, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jack Van Horn from the University of Virginia, and I'm proud to welcome you to this edition of our 2021-2022 Foundations of Biomedical Data Science Seminar Series. This lecture series is supported by UVA's Integrated Translational Health Institute of Virginia, the UVA Brain Institute, the College of Arts and Sciences, the School of Data Science, and through a grant from the National Institutes of General Medical Sciences. This year's theme is Ethical Challenges of Artificial Intelligence in Biomedicine, where we are enjoying presentations on Friday afternoons from leading thinkers about the promise, opportunities, and hurdles associated with AI applications in the biomedical sciences. Selected participants in our Biomedical Data Science Innovation Lab program will leverage these presentations as vital material for our culminating in-person grant project development workshop to be held here in historic Charlottesville, Virginia next June. Applications for the Biomedical Data Science Innovation Lab program are still being accepted up until January 31st, 2022. So please do consider applying or encouraging your junior colleagues to do so. We look forward to reviewing these application materials. Today, it is my honor and privilege to welcome our speaker, Dr. Jennifer Miller from Yale University School of Medicine. Dr. Miller is an assistant professor and director of the Good Pharma Scorecard, a ranking of pharmaceutical companies on their bioethics and social responsibility performance, and she is the founder of the nonprofit Bioethics International. Prior to joining Yale's faculty, Dr. Miller was based at the New York University School of Medicine, also at Duke University and at Harvard University. She's been a member of the World Economic Forum and co-founder of the new bioethics publication with Scientific American called Good Medicine. Her current work centers on ethics, equity, and data sharing in biomedical research. She is a recognized leader in empirical bioethics and developing and using metrics to enhance accountability across the pharmaceutical industry. She also explores the ethics and social concerns around the use of big data and AI in medicine and in biomedical research. She has over 80 peer-reviewed publications, including periodic articles appearing in periodicals such as Nature Medicine, Health Affairs, JAMA Oncology, the British Medical Journal, and has been the recipient, of multiple grants. She is a frequent news commentator and featured on CBS News, Wall Street Journal, and among other places. In continuing our 2021-2022 Biomedical Data Science Seminar Series theme, Jennifer's lecture today is entitled Ethics, Equity, and Transparency in Biomedical Research and the Role of the Good Pharma Scorecard. She's going to draw upon her wealth of experience in bioethics and pharmaceutical fields by discussing transparency and data sharing. And in addition, she will cover the importance of equitable access to the benefits of biomedical research. And what is more, we are super excited to have her serving as one of our 2021-2022 Biomedical Data Science Innovation Lab mentors. We're super excited about that. As always, we are streaming this lecture live and for recording via YouTube. And if you're watching on YouTube, thank you so much for joining us. Also, our specially selected 2021-2022 Biomedical Data Science Innovation Lab participants are encouraged to submit any questions they have for Jennifer via the chat feature in their Zoom sessions. I will personally synthesize these questions and ask them on your behalf during the last 10 minutes or so of Jennifer's lecture. And with that, welcome, Jennifer. We are so excited to hear from you today.
Thank you, Jack, for that overly generous introduction and for the opportunity to participate in today's seminar. Delighted to be here. As Jack mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at Yale School of Medicine and founder of the nonprofit Bioethics International, which I co-founded in 2005 to help advance ethics in healthcare and healthcare innovation. One of my capstone projects as my role at Yale University and Bioethics International is the Good Pharma Scorecard. The scorecard is an index designed to evaluate and rank pharmaceutical, biotech, and medical device companies on their bioethics and social responsibility performance annually. The process involves developing bioethics standards and accountability metrics for companies, and then using those metrics to evaluate and rank companies year after year to help us do three things: track our progress, industry's progress on bioethics goals over time, catalyze or incent improved behaviors where needed, and recognize and celebrate where there are best practices. So for today's seminar, I'm going to begin by briefly introducing the Good Pharma Scorecard and show how it currently works, measuring and ranking companies on their transparency and data sharing practices by reviewing the latest 2021 Good Pharma Scorecard rankings. And then we'll dive into some new measures that we're developing and piloting for the scorecard, which are focused on equity in biomedical research, or more specifically, equitable access to the benefits of clinical research. So let's begin with an introduction. The scorecard is currently focused on the role of industry in biomedical research, because industry sponsors the vast majority of clinical research, particularly clinical research supporting FDA approval of our new medicines, vaccines, and biologics and devices. We built the scorecard based on a review of 75 quality improvement strategies like accreditation, certification, ratings, and rankings. So you can think of the US News and World Report rankings of best colleges, or the restaurant grades that you might see on a restaurant window, dependent on its cleanliness, A, B, and C. And we also built the Good Pharma Scorecard based on a review of the literature, which generally shows that these types of quality improvement strategies can help improve practices within companies. So on the screen, you'll see one study sponsored by colleagues at Harvard and Duke, which reviewed 598 firms subject to ratings and found that low scoring firms substantially improve practices when they get a low score, supporting the old adage, what gets measured gets done. So the scorecard is designed to comprehensively address the key bioethics concerns about the pharmaceutical, medical device, and biotech sectors. However, we have only publicly debuted so far our rankings on transparency and data sharing practices. And we decided to prioritize transparency as our initial starting place, because in the first place, there was robust evidence suggesting a potential widespread transparency problem in clinical research. So on the screen, you see one example of a study conducted by Monique Anderson and Rob Califf, who were both at Duke at the time, published in New England Journal of Medicine, showing that 20% of registered clinical trials had reported results in clinicaltrials.gov, the NIH registry, within 1 year of their completion. And even if you looked at 5 years after the completion, you still could only find about 50% of trials having public results in the registry. So along with evidence of a potential problem, we also recognize the importance of clinical trial transparency for quality patient care. It's hard to practice evidence-based medicine if you have incomplete or biased data. Also, it is important for innovation, as scientists benefit from building upon the knowledge and research of other scientists, and honoring and protecting research participants. We don't often think about, why are we justified in allowing medical experimentation on people, on humans? And one of the reasons is its potential to contribute to generalizable knowledge that can help people, which is hard to accomplish when or if results and data remain behind locked doors. And further, transparency is important for trust. And we're focused on trustworthiness and appropriate trust in a sector. A recent study by Pew, or a survey, found that 57% of adults say they trust scientific research findings more if the researchers made their data publicly available. And as we're seeing right now and know from the literature, distrust can result in disengagement from a system. And in this case, hesitancy to use products like vaccines. And we're seeing this with COVID-19 vaccines right now. So the Good Pharma Scorecard 2021 rankings, we have 5 years of rankings, and I'll just present the most recent findings. The 2021 rankings, which came out in July or the summer of 2021 this year, focused on companies with a novel drug or biologic like a vaccine approved by the FDA in 2016 and 2017. And so here's what that sample characteristics look like. We ranked and evaluated 42 different companies, 17 large companies and 25 non-large. That sponsored a total of 62 products, 40 drugs, and 22 biologics, which were approved based on over 1,000 clinical trials. So to score companies on their transparency and data sharing, we first assess them on the trial level and then pool trials to get to a company score. So we look at 3 sets of trials in a new drug application or biologics license application. Basically, a company submits an application to the FDA for a product approval, much like a university student might submit a college application to a university for admissions. A company can do this to the FDA for a product approval. In that application, all of the trials, clinical trials that the company conducted on the experiment will be listed in there. And so what we do is we go through every FDA approval package to find all of the clinical trials that a company conducted and figure out the percentage of those with public results. And we look at 3 samples of those trials. First, the all trial sample, which is just what it sounds like, whether all, the percentage of all of those trials with public results. Then just the trials conducted in patients, basically excluding trials in healthy volunteers. And then third, just trials subject to legal reporting requirements under US laws. I'll dive more into this in a second. So I'm not going to go through every product finding because now the ratings include a lot of products, but we'll go through sort of the aggregate findings of what we found from this year's rankings. Per product, so per drug or biologic, a median of 62% of the trials conducted for FDA approval are publicly available. So 38% are publicly unavailable. On the product level, only 26% of our reviewed FDA-approved products were fully transparent, meaning they had summary results in a clinical trial registry or in a publication within 6 months of FDA approval of the product. If you narrow the sample from the all trials to just trials conducted in patients for the approved indication, per product, you'll find that a median of 100% of trials in patients per product are available. But if you step back and look at the product level, still you're only getting about 2/3 of products with public results for their trials within 6 months of FDA approval of a product. So 2/3 of products are fully transparent about the results of their patient trials, and 1/3, even for patient trials, are missing results. If you narrow the sample even further to just those trials subject to mandatory results reporting under the law, you'll still find 58% of products failing to meet baseline US legal requirements for clinical trial transparency. To put these into context a bit more, per product, there's a median of 13 clinical trials in an application. About 5 of those are in patients for the approved indications, would be in the patient trial sample, and then about 3 of those would be subject to mandatory legal disclosures, mandatory results reporting under the law. So that's the product level. So now let's aggregate up to the company level. So the company score does not include that all trials review. It includes the patient trials score and the legal compliance score, and then we add a data sharing score. So not just looking at whether summary results are reported in a clinical trial registry or in a paper, but actually looking if the company commits to sharing patient level data from a study. And here, I want to mention that we also give companies a 30-day amendment window. So we give companies their scores and we give them 30 days to improve things. And about half of low scoring companies have traditionally taken us up on that offer. And you can see all these green lines and improve their practices within 30 days of getting a low score. So here's what the 2021 company rankings look like. You'll see that about 58% of companies were fully transparent about all of the trials they conducted in patients for the approved indication for their products. 42% of companies met minimum legal requirements for results reporting, and 26% met the data sharing measures. Overall, 17% of companies, or 7 out of the 42 that we reviewed, fully met all of our transparency measures. So in an effort to create a race to the top, we emphasize a leaderboard, companies that score in the top 10 and also perfect score 100% on our measures. This shows that not only are these measures possible, they're reasonable, and it highlights best practices. So these are the companies that scored on the leaderboard this year. And we also do a deep dive factor analysis to try and understand the root causes of good and bad transparency performance. And here what you can see is looking at the association of company size, company location, and product type with transparency performance. What you can see is company size is driving transparency scores. And in this case, non-large companies, smaller companies are less likely to comply with laws, US laws requiring results reporting. Here you see that the median score for large companies is 100% and non-large, it's only 57%. And then smaller companies are less likely to have data sharing policies and data sharing policies that meet our measures. So large companies, the score is 100% on data sharing. In contrast to smaller companies, we have only 20%. So it's really the small company, the large companies are starting to perform better and better. And the small companies who are new to the scorecard this year, they're added to the scorecard for the first time this year, still have a lot of room for improvement. So as I mentioned, we've been doing this, we have 5 years worth of data. And the good news is that there's some evidence suggesting impact from the scorecard. In the first place, the 2019 Good Pharma Scorecard rankings published in BMJ showed that half of low-scoring large companies improved their practices and procedures within 30 days of receiving a low Good Pharma Scorecard score. Further, the industry company median scores are going up year after year, even though we're actually shortening the time frame for results reporting. Further, the scorecard is becoming institutionalized within the sector as companies, when they score well, are using it in their corporate social responsibility and human rights due diligence, annual reports, and social media outreach. So the more attention and more eyeballs on the scorecard, the more incentive there is for other companies to improve practices, the better lever for change it becomes. We're also have partnered with Scientific American to launch a new publication called Good Medicine, which reaches 8 to 9 million people annually. So this is what the first publication looked like. And we have worked with Ernst & Young in the past to sponsor our award ceremony every year. And so here you see the companies who scored in the top 5 the first few years getting their actual transparency awards. So based on this evidence suggesting a potential impact or a likely impact, we've decided we'd like to do more. And the next topic we're going to address is equity in biomedicine. So in particular, when we think about equity or equitable access to research benefits, we're just looking at 2 things so far. First is demographic representation or fair inclusion in clinical research. And I'll explain what these terms mean in a second. And the second one is fair access to medicines and vaccines among low and middle income countries who help us develop our medicines and vaccines by hosting clinical trials. So let's look at the first issue. many studies have shown that new medicines and vaccines tend to be tested on populations who are younger and healthier and more likely to identify as white than real-world patients in US clinical settings with studied conditions. So here you just see one study conducted by Luray and colleagues, which is showing that patients identifying as Black and Hispanic patients, as Black or Hispanic, are underrepresented in cancer trials in proportion to the disease burden measured by incidence and mortality. These underrepresentation in research is concerning for several reasons. One key one is it can leave doctors, payers, and patients in a quandary about how to apply trial findings to themselves or their clinical practices when they or their patients do not represent the racial identity, ethnicity, age, sex, or gender of trial participants. Excluding certain groups from research can exclude them from having treatments guided by evidence that applies to patients like them, which can potentially lead to harm exposure and lost opportunities to pursue more effective therapies. The literature has highlighted this problem and suggested some processes for improving it, like conducting more decentralized or community hospital-based trials, offering transportation and childcare for participants, broadening trial eligibility criteria. And there have been several high-profile efforts, policy efforts to diversify clinical trial participants, but all of this has had limited impact. Disparities persist, and here you can see a recent editorial from the editors of New England Journal of Medicine calling for a discussion about what it means to have acceptable and reasonable representation in clinical research. And you also see here a study from JAMA Network Open saying we need diversity enrollment targets for research because we currently don't have them. So when you look at the literature, there are two main ways for assessing demographic representation in clinical research or fair inclusion. One way is to compare the demographics of participants enrolled in a trial to the demographics of the US population. The other way is a method developed by Dr. Rita Poon, who at the time was at the FDA, published in 2013, which involves constructing a participation to prevalence ratio, or a PPR, which you can do by dividing the percent of a particular population in among study participants by the percent of that particular population in the real world disease population. So for example, if we wanted to look at women, we would compare the percent of women participating in a trial to their proportion in the disease population. It's a pretty basic equation. Our team, in a study led by a brilliant Yale medical student, Tanvi Varma, used Poon's method to assess demographic representation for novel cancer drugs approved by the FDA between 2012 and 2016. It was about 45 cancer therapeutics. And the first thing to note is that we found transparency problems. A lot of the demographic data were not transparent for products and trials. Only 48% of pre-market studies, meaning trials conducted before approval, had publicly available ethnicity data. 77% had age data, and 81% had race data. Sex is actually very consistently reported. And in the post-marketing studies, these numbers go down. Only 30% of post-marketing studies have publicly available ethnicity data, 48% race, 64% age, and 75% sex. For the trials that we were able to find the demographic composition, we then looked at representation. While we found that women were generally adequately represented in pre and post-marketing studies, older adults and patients identifying as Black were underrepresented in both pre and post-marketing studies. So now our team is working on building a company ranking informed by Poon's PPR methods to set fair inclusion targets for companies and use those to benchmark their performance, track our progress, and recognize where there are best practices. So we anticipate half the score looking at the transparency of demographic data, and the other half to actually look at the composition, the demographic representation of a trial. And we'll put those scores together to come up with a fair inclusion score. Along with considering who we should enroll in research, I'm also interested in what we might owe populations participating in research, starting with national populations. Many studies have shown that clinical research supporting US medicine and vaccine approvals has been globalized and is largely conducted in other countries, increasingly lower income countries. Here you see just one study focused on heart failure trials, which found participant enrollment from North America decreased from 43% from 2001 to 2004 to 27% between 2013 to 2014. And to my knowledge, the rate at which market access to products is obtained by the countries hosting these trials, supporting FDA product approvals, had not been studied. And so I sought to design a study to answer three questions. First, where are our novel drugs and biologics being tested? Secondly, how commonly and quickly are these medicines approved for marketing in the countries where they are tested? And three, are there any differences occurring in these approvals by country income and geographic regions? Before I go over the results, I want to say that marketing access, meaning whether a country approves a product for marketing, does not guarantee a patient can afford a product or vaccine or that there is a reasonable supply, but is generally a critical precondition for those later important stage access issues. So this is why we started with marketing approval to begin with. So this sample looked at FDA approved drugs in 2012 and 2014, sponsored by large companies. Large companies were defined as the 20 largest by market cap. So our sample looked at, the FDA approved a total of 79 novel drugs in 2012 and 2014, 34 of which, or 43%, were sponsored by large pharmaceutical companies, approved based on a total of 898 trials, 63% of which had publicly available trial locations. And these products targeted a total of 28 unique cancer indications. 63% of trials had trial location data and the rest did not. And we found that each drug was tested in a median of 25 different countries in addition to the United States, including a median of 20 high-income countries, 6 upper middle income countries, a median of 1 low middle income country, and a median of 0 low income countries. Only one drug in our sample was tested in a low-income country, and that was Soturo, a TB-related treatment, was tested in Kenya. But 17 drugs were tested in South Africa. So within 1 year of FDA approval, only 3% of the drugs in our sample were approved for marketing in all the countries where they were tested. If you look at 5 years later, you still only find about 15% of these drugs approved for marketing where they were tested. On the country level, there were 70 countries that contributed research participants for these FDA approvals. And what we found is that 7% of these countries got market access to those drugs within 1 year of FDA approval. And even if you look at 5 years, you're still only finding about 31% of countries with marketing approval. And these numbers don't change substantially if you bump it out to 7 years. 30% of countries. Stratifying market access by country income level, which is what you see on the screen now, we found that 13% of high-income countries got market access to products within 1 year, compared to 0 upper middle and 0 lower middle. Looking at 5 years out, you see that 46% of high-income countries got access, 9% of upper middle, and 22% of lower middle income countries at 5 years. Breaking these findings out by geographical region, market access was lowest in African countries, followed by the Middle Eastern countries, and access was highest, unsurprisingly, in Canada and Eastern Europe at 5 years, followed by Western European countries and Oceania. Latin American countries and Asian countries fell towards the middle of the pack. As I mentioned at the beginning, marketing access doesn't guarantee that there are enough doses or that a product is affordable. So our team conducted another study led by Reshma Ramachandra at Yale, a fellow at Yale, examining market access to COVID-19 vaccines in the countries where they were tested. So we focused on the World Health Organization vaccines recommended for use. And we found that for completed trials, they were tested in also a total of 25 countries as of September 7th, 2021. And we found that among the 11 high-income countries hosting completed trials, 91% authorized the tested vaccine and received enough doses to vaccinate a median of 52% of their populations, age 15 and older. However, you looked at lower middle and upper middle income countries, the rates of authorization were high, 100% and 91% respectively. However, the median vaccination rates were much lower. They were 31% and 15% of their populations respectively. And if you look at including ongoing and completing trials, the corresponding rates go up for high income countries and they go down for all other income level countries, all other income groups. And this is a study that we didn't conduct. This was done by Nouria Hamadi's. And that research group looked at drugs approved by the FDA in 2011 and 2012 to see if they were registered and commercialized, but they also looked at affordability in Latin American countries where they were tested. And what they found is that they looked at 33 products and they expected to see them registered in 114 different places. And they found that only 60% were registered where they were tested. And that with only one exception, all of the products cost more than the monthly minimum wage in all of those countries. And 12 products cost at least 5 times the monthly minimum wage in the country, concluding that many pharmaceutical products tested in Latin America are unavailable and or unaffordable to most of the populations. So from an ethics perspective, ethicists tend to agree that communities providing trial participants should stand to benefit from their participation. And you can find this principle in the Declaration of Helsinki and the CIOMS guidelines for international clinical research. A corollary of this principle is that to avoid exploitation, research should not ordinarily be conducted in a national population that does not stand to benefit from the knowledge to be gained or the interventions to be developed. And that language is taken from the Helsinki Declaration. Since this clearly is not consistently happening, we are now building measures for the Good Pharma Scorecard to start tracking our progress and incenting change in this area where needed. So wrapping up, the Good Pharma Scorecard is designed to address the key bioethics challenges around biomedical innovation focusing on clinical trials sponsored by industry. And so far, we've launched the scorecard to address clinical trial transparency and data sharing practices. And this year, we'll be debuting our new equity measures and rankings for biomedical research. There's evidence suggesting that the Good Pharma Scorecard is having an impact, with scores going up on the measures that we add to the scorecard, and 50% of large scoring companies improving procedures within 30 days of getting a low score for the 2019 rankings. Socially responsible indices and environmental social governance, ESG funds and investors are beginning to use and look at the rankings. And the software that large companies use to check their own transparency is building some of our measures into their software to automate companies' use of the scorecard or evaluation of how they might score. So we hope to continue to have a beneficial impact for patients and continue to develop measures and pilot them. So now I look forward to hearing everybody's questions and comments.
Jennifer, thank you so much. What an intriguing idea coming up with the Good Pharma Score. It kind of reminds me of a Zagat score or a Michelin stars, or and of course, many of us who are at universities, or a lot of our universities seem to pay possibly undue amount of attention to their U.S. news rankings. It's interesting because each one of those different ranking systems takes on kind of a different approach. I think the Zagat score, or at least it used to, depend upon the rankings available from like diners going to restaurants, for example. So it'd basically be crowdsourced. Whereas the Michelin scores, for example, are expert restaurant diners would go and evaluate them. So it's kind of a couple different models. And then I think even U.S. News has a kind of different number and variety of things that they rank relative to another university ranking system like the Times of London University ones. Are you aware of any other systems that attempt to do this? And do they have a different approach than yours, or are you the only game in town at the moment?
Right. Well, if there were other groups doing this, I probably wouldn't have started. So the short answer is, from a bioethics perspective, no. However, there is one other ranking system related and complementary to our work, but not duplicative, and it's the Access to Medicines Index, which was, I think, at one point actually funded by the Gates Foundation. And ATMI looks at the accessibility of products in low and middle income countries, but it doesn't overlap at all with our work.
That's nice. So you have your own niche then.
Right, for better or worse. Yes, if you're interested in the social responsibility, performance, and bioethics of the pharmaceutical sector, you're stuck with the Good Pharma Scorecard.
I think that's just fine. What does the FDA have in terms of its expectations for companies? It seems like a lot of the work that you've drawn from, obviously, is the data that you're mining here comes from FDA-approved clinical trials. Does the FDA have any standards or anything against which people are supposed to adhere to, or is that sort of loosey-goosey, I guess?
So it's a good question. So embedded in your question is a larger question, which is, what kind of ethical responsibilities do we want to ask of companies? From a minimal ask, we'd want them to comply with US laws. And so, although I would, argue that ethics is clearly not synonymous with legal compliance, but there is a law, if you're thinking about transparency and data sharing in the US, that requires companies to report summary results of trials they conduct, non-phase 1 trials conducted in patients in the US or by US sponsor. And what I tried to show in my initial slides was how narrow that law was, right? So if it's a large company sponsors 25 different experiments for FDA approval of their product. If you look at all companies, it's about 13 trials per product. And the law covers a median of 3 of those. And some products are approved based on 0 trials that are subject to mandatory disclosures under the law. But notwithstanding the narrowness or arguable narrowness of the law, substantial amount of companies fail to meet baseline legal requirements. So to answer that's a long answer to say there are laws, right, so things that the FDA could require. However, they're not being followed, and so the FDA, the government could impose penalties for non-compliance, which it has yet to do.
Is that politically motivated, do you feel, or financially motivated, that the FDA hasn't imposed penalties on some of these companies?
Well, so I'm empirical based, so I would suggest a qualitative study of FDA employees to find out what happens. But one hunch is that when the law was originally introduced, FDAA, in 2007, in my opinion, the language was opaque, and it wasn't. So I think there was some exploitation of the ambiguities in the law, and perhaps that caused some challenges in applying it. And so, let's hope that the FDA. There are a lot of reasons, but I'm not going to comment on those. But let's hope that the FDA starts better monitoring and enforcing this law. It's just started issuing non-compliance letters to companies for the first time, but it's really only gone out to a handful of companies in comparison to how many should receive such letters. And like I said, I don't believe to this date any civil penalties have been collected, any monetary penalties.
Okay. Do you work with any legal scholars who can kind of help provide guidance and insight on, kind of what is allowable, or what kind of the range of things that exist within those laws? Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. Well, FDAA was clarified in 2017, so there's not as much of a range of allowable sort of interpretations. But yeah, on those papers, you'll see a couple legal scholars. Michelle Mello is in this law school at Stanford, but actually kind of goes the reverse way. Since we're working with legal scholars, sometimes we know more, because when you start to apply and measure compliance, it raises more questions than if you just look at the language. So we work together on interpreting the law.
Do you, you also mentioned that the Good Pharma Score can be applied to medical devices as well. And I think the examples you gave were largely pharmaceutical companies. Are you working with any, or rather working with any data from medical device companies as they're kind of, prototyping or attempting to get data on the efficacy of a particular medical device at all?
Yes, thank you so much for asking. So this year, we are adding medical devices for the first time. So we looked at all of the original or novel medical devices that the FDA approved in 2017 and benchmarked them using the same methods. So you'll have to stay tuned for a couple more months before those findings come out, but it adds a substantial number of companies and products to our reviews. And every year going forward, you'll now see drugs, biologics, and medical devices. Every year we expand the scorecard incrementally. And this year was the addition of biologics and devices. That's great. And all size companies.
Yeah. Well, and you again have focused. It looks like most of your data comes from FDA related activities. Are you looking at companies from other countries, for example, Great Britain or the European Union or elsewhere, where pharmaceutical scores would also be helpful?
The company doesn't have to be based in the US to get ranked. They just have to submit a product for FDA approval. And it turns out that the location of a country actually doesn't correlate with a change in transparency practice or score. It's really the size of company. That was that, trying to find that slide. So products submitted to the FDA for approval are not entirely based in the US, they're global, and research is globalized. So by nature, the studies are all global.
Yeah, I guess I meant the like the European, for example, or the British equivalent of the Food and Drug Administration. Can you mine any information that they have that's publicly available? Because there may be companies that apply for a approval in one country that don't send something into the Food and Drug Administration?
EMA approval,
Perhaps, yeah.
the European Medicines Association. Yeah, so there's usually a strong relation between, say, the Canadian, the European, and the US
Okay.
drug
I
agency.
understand.
But so you wouldn't necessarily have to use the EMA data or Canadian or sort of a developed country. But what would be interesting, and what we're not doing, is looking at not initial novel drugs, but generics. Right.
Oh, okay.
So because they are often, more, they may not all make it to the US market. So because we're only looking at novel products, it makes sense for us to focus on FDA, EMA, and Canadian approved drugs.
I see. That makes sense. Now, it's interesting because you were talking about, I was writing down a question myself about this at the very minute you brought up your slide and kind of answered it for me, was, is the score that a company gets related to the size of that company? So I saw Amgen was, I think, number 2 on the list, and there's a few other major pharmaceutical companies. And as you move down the list, they tended to get smaller. So there appeared to be a relationship there that you answered. And I was also kind of curious about whether the score is related to their stock price or, some other profit margin related index. And I was just curious if, because I presume that size of the company and their stock price is correlated. So I wouldn't be surprised if the score was also correlated with their, some financial element of that particular company. Do you find that you track that kind of information too?
Can you expand on that? Your sense is if there's a dip in the price that you'd see a dip in the score?
Well, for example, I presume that if stock price is, varies linearly with their score, was just kind of curious if that's something you see evidence of.
Yeah, we're looking at that right now. Stay tuned.
Okay.
I mean, I have to say the scorecard, my sense is, and I have a hunch, but we need to really measure the alpha, is it's a good predictor of potential future problems. Like we saw Valiant tank in the scorecard, before the scandals broke out about it buying supposedly undervalued drugs and marking them up a median of 200%, right? The sort of scandalous business model. Valiant is no more. I think it's Bausch and Lomb or Bausch and Health, and Google the right name. So my hunch is there is a correlation between transparency, performance, possibly also ethics in general, and other factors, but we need to do a deep dive in that.
Sure. So when you are in your own kind of work here, what effort do you make to make the data that you're gathering and the analyses and their interpretation open and transparent and accessible?
For anyone who wants to dig through this data, which I encourage you to do, and if make use of it. It's on Dryad. It's a nonprofit repository, and we put all of our raw data sheets on Dryad every year. And they actually are used a lot, heavily downloaded. I think mostly by lawyers, double checking our work. I know one time an industry trade association sort of hired a communications firm to redo all of our analyses. Didn't find much differences. But something I should mention is that we send all of our data to the companies for validation. So they get all of their raw data sheets and they have an opportunity to correct anything that they think might need correcting. And if we can verify what they say through public sources like other FDA documents or other regulatory body documents, we will make corrections. And sometimes, I would say not infrequently, there are typos in the FDA documents. So that validation process can be helpful.
That's great. What role could there be for people doing data science and AI related work as two different elements of this, on something like this to help kind of expand the dimensionality and the nuance that goes into the Good Pharma score?
I would love to hear from you guys, what ethical challenges you're encountering or things you'd like to see done better. For sure, if you're doing data science and using AI to analyze data, there's not a lot of transparency in that space, right? The algorithms used are often opaque, sometimes because they're proprietary.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important that we start to talk about what transparency means in those data sets and for those algorithms. Also, that we think about the same things I just presented, right? Are there biases in the data? Who's represented in the data? We know genomic data, for example, tends to be overwhelmingly Caucasian and from certain countries, global South being underrepresented. And then when it's the exact same challenges we're seeing here when non-high income countries or the global South are included in data sources, what are they getting in return for that? Just like we said here, we tend to test drugs. If we test drugs in low-income countries, we're not even making them available on the market, let alone affordable or insufficient supply. And so we definitely don't want to repeat these mistakes in the newer emerging space of AI and big data. So I think now is really a good time to start thinking through that and trying to chart a course forward in a good path.
Have you communicated with lawmakers, senators, congressmen, and others who may be influential in helping to craft new laws or tidy up existing laws that may kind of encourage pharmaceutical companies to not be as transparent?
There is a group at Yale called CRIT, the Collaboration for Research Integrity and Transparency. That is full of a powerhouse of lawyers, and they have used these findings and the findings of others to submit, to work on the advocacy on the policy level with some success. So this work supports their work, but I am not an advocate, right? I am a sort of a researcher. So certainly partner with groups like CRIT. But if you're looking for lobbyists and advocates, I'd look more towards them, not lobbyists, but advocates for policy change.
Does the does the score and the subscales that you're measuring, do you see that growing over, say, the next 5 years in terms of the number of, it seems like you are, the number of different dimensions? Are there any other dimensions that, are maybe ones that you're considering but haven't quite fully fleshed out yet, where they may be areas of further growth over the next, say, 5 years or so?
Yeah, so the idea of the scorecard is to be comprehensive and look at all of the bioethics and social responsibility concerns we have about companies, particularly those that are important to get right for patient health, for our health, all around the world. So after clinical trial transparency and data sharing and adding the medical devices, we're going to target equity in biomedical research, looking at those two issues to begin with: who's included in research, right? Fair inclusion and representation of groups, beginning with sex, gender, age, race, and ethnicity. And then not only looking at who's included, but then what are they getting in exchange for participating? And on that, we'll look on the national level, which countries are participating in clinical research and helping us develop drugs and vaccines, and seeing what they're getting in exchange for participation, starting very humbly with looking at whether they get market access, and then ideally expanding also into looking at the affordability and availability of products, so including drug pricing, akin to that study that I presented about South American countries or Latin American countries. That will keep us busy for, I would suspect, a good amount of months. We can go faster the more funding we have, which we're working on. And then after that, we'll have to, step back and see what's going on. But again, the end goal is to have a comprehensive bioethics and social responsibility index. I am exploring partnering with a couple groups to add in the environmental impact of pharma to create a more comprehensive ESG index. And it's remarkable that we just don't have an ESG index focused on pharma. So within 5 years, the dream or the ideal goal is to have a comprehensive ESG set of measures and rankings that are used by investors and anyone with any kind of lever to really catalyze or continue the change that we need to see in the sector, given its important role in all of our health. And I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted how important it is to get things right with this sector in terms of the way it develops drugs and vaccines and the way they ultimately become accessible and reachable for all of us.
Well, Jennifer, on that note, it's a great place to kind of stop. You've given us so much to think about and kind of think about the social responsibility, the ethical responsibility of major pharmaceutical companies and how we might rank them and kind of sort them and hopefully encourage those that are not doing such a good job about ways in which they might improve and how we might help to develop best practice standards based upon these different target areas that you're focusing on. I look forward to seeing how this develops over the next 5 to 10 years or so. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us. And thank you everybody for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And we'll wish you all a good Friday and a very good weekend. And we'll see you next week. Thanks again, Jennifer.
Thanks.